Good evening. Welcome back to the Bible Speaks Today from LBC TV Ministries. I was talking to the cameraman as we came on. I forgot what I was supposed to say. Should know it by heart by now. If you're watching the credits, it says Thessalonians, Philemon and Titus. Or Philemon and Titus, or Titus and Philemon. Anyway, don't worry about that for the minute. We are going to finish off that little bit of 1 Thessalonians, which I did not get time to finish last week. And I apologize for the hurried, but you know, when they throw the signs at you and then they start throwing the signs at you, you've got to get, you've got to get a move on. I got a bit flustered actually. Okay, apologize for the spectacles again if it's causing any glinting problems, but it is allergy season here in downtown Kentucky, as they say, and I seem to be susceptible. How is it you go through your whole life, until your late 60s, early 70s, with no allergies, and suddenly you get allergies? I mean, it doesn't make sense, does it? Never mind. Okay, a couple of things I want to talk about for programs preceding these last few. I pushed a theory, or I discussed a theory that's been put out by a number of well-known scholars, and I tend to go kind of along with them myself, about who wrote Hebrews, if you remember. And we put it out that it might have been Priscilla, Paul's leading light in Rome, and the reason why there's no intro or no closer on it is because of the less than charitable way the early church treated women. And I've had some correspondence on that, mostly emails and that sort of thing. And I should tell you that you may be interested or not, that there are some people who watch the program, or watch our internet program, and this program, of course, or these programs on the internet, and who actually contact me and make comments. Now, they're not all staunch Protestants. Some of them are just people I know, friends in other countries, who feel obliged for one reason or another to let me know that they see me from time to time and have comments. And the reaction to my comment about Priscilla writing Hebrews seemed to be kind of all saying, why not? Why not indeed? What a good idea, etc., etc. I'm not sure how it's been received here locally. I've had nothing from our local viewers. They're probably boiling up the tar, getting the feathers ready. The point I make is that when I said the less than charitable way that the early church treated women, it's absolutely true. In the early days of Christianity, in the time Paul was on his mission trips, as we call them, the church took Jesus at his word, that male, female, black, white, yellow, polka dot, whatever, all were the same in Christ. But with trouble with humans is we get caught up in the interest, and then when it starts to be less than exciting, it's not new anymore, the old familiar attitudes creep back in. That the church, when I say the church, I mean the Christian church. I'm not talking about Jewish church, Islam or Judaism. They have their own problems. Don't think I'm qualified or not knowledgeable enough to talk about them. But the Christian church, the Protestant church, if you will, that great big blanket, was and still is very ungallant as far as it treats women in the church structure. Not as far as believers coming to church, as people in the congregation singing in the choir, but when it comes to women preaching at church, there are churches within this northern Kentucky area here who do not, quote, suffer a woman to preach, do not let women teach Sunday school. In other words, do not put women in any position where they could be senior to men, which not only is extremely short-sighted, I'm not even sure it's biblical. In fact, I'm sure it's not biblical. And if you want a perfect example about how the church sometimes, I think deliberately, has in the past deliberately cut short the influence of women, and some of the time after Paul, I think, is a good time, because Paul's letters state unequivocally that women were extremely powerful movers and shakers within the early Christian church, and then suddenly they're not. Can anyone tell me what happens to Mary, the mother of Jesus, after the crucifixion in John's Gospel? And if you can, I'll be totally amazed, because there is no more. Right? The mother of Jesus, who's a very, very big figure in all the Gospels up until the crucifixion, and then simply disappears. Now, if you're a Catholic, I believe there's all sorts of legends and stories about Mary and, this, that and everything else. She went here, she went there. But there is no biblical evidence and not even any historical evidence. It's just tradition, stories, this sort of thing. And there's nothing wrong with that if that's what makes you feel happy. But the Mother of God, if you will, as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, drops out of sight instantly time the resurrection comes. I mean, she's not even really mentioned in the resurrection stories, is she? I mean, I realize Jesus was the Son of God, was God, had a different mission in his portfolio, as they say. When he came back after the resurrection, it was to encourage and charge and guide the disciples and the early church. But he didn't go and see his mother. Well, why not? Couldn't handle the shock, whatever. If Mary, and I've got to assume this by what she says in her various things, if Mary didn't know who Jesus was, I'd be totally surprised. But the early church just dismisses her out of hand. I'm not even sure if there's where she was buried, where she died, when she died. We know that she was taken care of by John. John doesn't even say much about her after that. Paul doesn't mention her. None of the Peter and his letters, nobody mentions her. It's like, okay, you've done your job, thank you very much, goodbye. And I think the church, as a whole thing, has been like that towards women for centuries. And it's funny too, how people in the church, in some of the people that Paul mentions, I mean, he mentions a score of women leading churches, wives of leading members. Tonight we're going to talk about Titus. He mentions Titus. Titus is mentioned 14 times in Acts. Okay? And we don't know anything about him. Literally don't know anything about him. There's a little bit of background, but not much. I mean, other than it's a name that people use from time to time, we don't know it. And yet, from what we can gather from what Paul says, he was a shaker and a mover. Anyway, that was an answer, by the way, I forgot to tell you at the beginning. That's an answer to an email I got from a couple of people, well, not emails, a couple of people questioning the role of women in the church, or not questioning it, but stating that in their view, and these weren't women, funnily enough, they were gentlemen, stating that they thought that the treatment of women in the church then and now was despicable, and I couldn't agree more. And if you're out there and you're a dyed-in-the-wool fundamentalist who believes that women should have no part in church organization and everything, all I can use is the quaint American expression, get real. Wasn't what Christ wanted. It's certainly a matter of, as far as I'm concerned, of the masculine need to be in control. That's it. I'm sure I'm going to get letters on that and emails on that. A couple of other things. First of all, you see this thing. We've been, I use the scripts here, my notes, I foolscap piece of paper with about 6 talking points on it. And I'm told by my camera crew and by other people I spend too much time rustling the papers and looking at them and everything. So I said, fine, we'll go the other way. And my Nook has all my scripts on it, obviously, because that's how I study them. So we're going to use that. So if you hear the occasional ding-ding or something like that, it's the Nook doing its thing. And it does have hopefully the battery holds together. And otherwise I'll have to remember everything. Okay, so we were talking about 1 Thessalonians last week, and I finished up before I had a chance to finish. So what I was going to say was this. The big passage in Thessalonians is how Paul and Silas get kicked out of the town because the Jews complain that they are putting up a king in saying that Caesar's not the king. Okay? And you have to think of the irony of this. I asked the chaps here before I came in tonight, the irony of that statement. Okay? The Jews appear to be jealous to support Caesar, which certainly wouldn't go along with Orthodox Judaism at the time, would it now? And the second thing is, I asked you guys this, when was the other time that the Jews cared more about Caesar than they did about the faith? And of course everyone knows that one. You know, we have no king but Caesar, part of the appearance before Pontius Pilate. It's just interesting and ironic in a way, if you like, that the same thing happens to Paul in Thessalonica. And it's ironic, I say, because that view wouldn't have occurred to Orthodox Judaism. They would have hated Caesar. You know, even though they lived in a city where there's certain taxes paid, they lived in a free city, which relieved them of having to pay taxes to Rome, if you will, okay? And the other intriguing question from that is, why did Paul bring up Jesus' second coming in the first place? Okay? I mean, this seems quite normal to us because he mentions it, you know, in all his letters and that sort of thing. But there's nothing in Acts, when it's talking about the trial, you know, that says Paul says anything about it. That Paul, you know, wasn't saying there was another king but Jesus, just that he'd been raised from the dead. Okay? Now, you've got to look at this from arguing against the Jewish authorities. They may have had a debate where they would have said, well, yeah, fine, you say he's the Messiah, but the Messiah is supposed to bring about the change in the kingdom. The kingdom is supposed, you know, Israel is supposed to rise up again and attain its former glory. Totally missing the point, of course. Okay, so therefore he couldn't be the Messiah. And Paul's response would be, well, hang on a bit, you know, he will do that, you know, later on, second coming, someday. And the reason that he hasn't come back yet, the reason he's not come back yet, is because the Jews have rejected him. Well, that probably was like a red rag to a bull anyway. So then they come up with a charge that proclaiming that, well, you know, Jesus is king. It has some basis in fact, you know, and of course trumped up charges always sound much better than they do, you know, than the reason. Okay? So, once again, we have a situation where, for political reasons, the Jewish community doesn't want to hear what Paul is saying. And I didn't go really into that during the program. Now, the other part I wanted to talk about was in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul says that he wanted to return to Thessalonica again and again. Now, I don't think we should agree that Paul actually set out or tried to get to Thessalonica more than once. I think that the hindering by Satan, was perhaps a reminder of the damage that he would do to Jason, who put up the money, remember, if he ever would come back again. So I think Paul is saying, you know, I thought about coming back quite a lot, but, you know, the ramifications of that are tremendous for Jason, right? Which is, of course, why he sent Timothy to suss out what was going on, okay? The other point about the Philippians, in Philippians it talks about sending the aid to Paul while he was there. It's only 95 miles from Philippi to where Paul was, okay? 95 miles on the Via Ignatia, the Ignatian Way, which is a Roman road, you know, straight. So, and if Paul stayed in Thessalonica, you know, 27 days, as we agreed, that's probably more likely. I mean, the Philippians could have sent him funds 5 times. And here's the interesting thing. Most of them got paid in those days every day. You didn't get paid once a week or once a month. Or every 2 weeks, whatever you guys get, you know. Or if we're on the government, once a month, all right? They get paid every day. So if they wanted to help on a regular basis, they could well have sent money, you know, oh, it's Thursday, send some money to Paul. So it's not so out of the question, all right? And the other thing was about the makeup of Thessalonians. We won't go into it too much, but most scholars agree that the chapters 1 through 3, chapters 1 through 3 look like they are responses to Timothy coming back from Thessalonica and saying, hey, guess what? They're doing this, they're doing that, they're doing this and everything else. And the first 3 chapters are basically Paul saying, Timothy's reported to me, you're doing so well in this and that. And the last 2 are the questions, I think, that the Thessalonians had raised themselves. In other words, Timothy goes and says, oh, you're doing this, you're having services, you're meeting, you're living the Christ life, blah, blah, blah. And then the Thessalonians said, well, we've got some problems. What about the people who've died, before this second coming? What's going to happen to them? One to us. So Paul is really answering the Thessalonians' questions, about that. Okay. So that's what I didn't get through the last time. Okay. All right. So moving on, as they say, and chase my little pad here. The only trouble with this is you've got to wait till it boots up, so you've got to go then. We're now going to move on to, as it said, the epistle to Philemon. Okay, it's known as Philemon, and everyone knows it as that in the book, right? Because that's who it's addressed to. Okay, it's the smallest book in the New Testament. I'm just going to go through the outline, and we'll go into it in a bit more detail. It's a prison letter, as far as we know. It's co-authored. Now, here's something that people forget to think about. It's co-authored by Timothy and Paul. In other words, they're both contributing to it, okay? And it's to Philemon, who, we hadn't heard of him before, is a leader in the church at Colossae, okay? Okay? And it deals basically, if we can go into much more detail later, but it deals basically with the themes of reconciliation and forgiveness, something we could all use. Now, it's interesting in this letter that Paul doesn't go on with his usual thing. Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, I was chosen on the road to Damascus. I'm qualified to this and that and everything else. He doesn't identify himself as this, but simply as a prisoner of Jesus Christ, calls Timothy our brother, okay, and addressing Philemon as a fellow laborer, as another worker, and as a brother. In other words, it's a really toned down personal letter. Okay? It's not the, I don't want to say pompous, but it's not the, okay guys, this is a letter about faith and judgment, and by golly, I'm Paul and you better listen to me. It's a, hi brother, I got a couple of things to say, okay? I suppose the difference between, one of the guys writing to the tax company asking for a deferral on the $10 million he owes and saying, dear sir, I am so-and-so, and writing to his brother saying, hey mate, how's it going? That's the style of the letter, okay? Now, just to briefly go over it, Onesimus was a slave, now hold that thought about the slave, okay, that had departed from his master, in other words, he'd run away, okay, Philemon, and he was returning with this letter. And in the letter, Paul's saying he's returning to you, and I'm asking you to receive him as a beloved brother. In other words, he's a Christian. We're all in this together. So whatever he's done, I'm asking you to forgive him. So again, reconciliation there. But we'll go on to that in a bit more detail a little bit later on, maybe in the next program. Anyway, Philemon was a wealthy Christian, possibly a bishop. Now, you have to be careful about this. That's a comment I got from one of my research papers, possibly a bishop, which means that there was a structure in the church at Colossae that didn't exist in some of the other churches. Now, maybe it's just a commentator's idea. Maybe it's a complementary title, because it was a house church. People met in Philemon's house, okay, in Colossae. So maybe the gentleman that I looked at and got this comment about a bishop, and I got an asterisk against it, meaning not necessarily factual, is that later on in church life, shall we say, early church life, 2nd century, we did have bishops and things like that, which after all was just a sort of an overseer. Bishop means overseer. But it's unlikely at this point in time, although these are the last few letters that Paul wrote, so maybe that structure had started to come in. It certainly wasn't there when he wrote to the Corinthians, certainly wasn't there when he wrote to the Thessalonians, okay? But maybe the structure's coming. But as we'll see later, that particular comment there, maybe a bishop, is one of the reasons why people say, well, maybe Paul didn't write this. Now, we believe he did, but we'll talk about that in a later too. But it's generally most scholars regard this as undisputed work of Paul. It's the shortest of his letters. I mean, Paul wrote some pretty long letters. I wrote it down here. Where is it? Oh, yeah. It's only 445 words, if you're counting, and 25 verses. So if you're in Sunday school and as a punishment you've got to learn one of the books of the Bible, go to Philemon. It's the easiest. Okay, let's get some more details here. Paul, who was a prisoner. Now, here's the thing. People automatically assume Paul was a prisoner in Rome. Not necessarily. He could have been a prisoner in Ephesus. There was a Roman town, Roman garrison, Roman prison in Ephesus, and Paul could well have been held there. And Timothy, and we can't seem to, nobody seems to be able to, if Timothy was just a visitor, somebody who, like a companion, or whether he was in there with him or not. I don't think so, because Timothy gets to get out. But anyway, so he writes to a fellow Christian called Philemon, okay, and two of his associates. Now, the woman is called Apphia, okay, and most scholars today believe that Apphia was the wife of Philemon. And the gentleman and a fellow worker called Archippus is again expected to be her son. And the reason a lot of scholars lean towards that is, first of all, the church is in his house. He's holding the church services in Philemon's house, right? Who else would be involved? Well, his wife, obviously. She's probably feeding and, providing drinks for everybody. And his son Archippus, who probably follows in his father's footsteps. But already there's people in there that we don't really know much about, but scholars generally believe by the way he addresses them that they were the family of Philemon, okay? Which is interesting because we don't hear much of people's families. None of the gospel writers, none of the letter writers, we don't hear very much of the families. Even Paul, who had some people say was married or had been married, although there's no proof of that either way, okay? But they all appear, Archippus appears to have some sort of important role in the church that met in the house. He's mentioned elsewhere, actually, in Colossians 4. It talks about him being a great guy and that sort of thing. So, maybe he was a young man who was working hard for the church. Okay? Now, since Onesimus was a Colossian, and if you want to know that, read Colossians 4:9, because in there it expressly says he's one of you, meaning a Colossian. Okay, it can be assumed, though it's not actually said, but it can be assumed that Philemon lived in Colossae. I mean, it doesn't actually say that, but we can assume he did. Okay. The other thing it can be assumed is that he was probably fairly wealthy, because by the standards of the early church anyway, because he had a big enough house, large enough to accommodate, let's say 100 people, maybe 150 people, for a worship service. Which sometimes I like to see this, because there's a lot of criticism, people who criticize the early church and Christianity in general, who say that it is a faith for cripples and poor people. They've got to have something to hang on to. Rich people don't believe in Christ. Well, I've got to say this, there probably exist quite a few rich people who don't, or they don't appear to. But here's a guy who, by standards of the early church, is fairly well off and believes in Jesus, all right? Okay? Now, as I said at the beginning, Paul is writing to Philemon on behalf of Onesimus, a former slave who left him and run away. Now, it doesn't say run away. It doesn't say escaped. It doesn't say, anything else. It just says who left him. And this business with the slave thing has caused a few, ripples, discussions, this sort of thing. All right? I mean, it's not self-evident from the letter exactly what's happening. Onesimus is described as having departed. Okay? And Paul goes on to say, this is kind of interesting, Paul's sense of humor here, and I'll read it out because this is, departed from once having been useless to him. Now, you think, what's all that about? Well, it's a pun on Onesimus' name, which means useful. Okay? The name means useful. And then Paul goes on to say, haven't done him wrong. Now, most modern scholars kind of agree that Onesimus was a runaway slave who'd become a Christian believer. Now, there's no evidence for that. We don't have anything about Onesimus' conversion. We don't have another story in another letter about Onesimus, who I converted at this place, that place. The only thing is, it's hardly likely that Paul would send somebody back with a letter to one of his Christian church leaders who wasn't a believer, who wasn't sort of caught up in this. It's far too unlikely the letter would go astray or be used against him and this sort of thing. And Paul sent him back basically to face his master, owner, whatever. And again, slave may not mean the I bought you for a slave and paid money for you. It can be the sort of thing where people said, okay, I'll work for rood and board for 10 years. I'll work for you, and you pay me, a little bit a day, and I get a good living. I mean, that happened a lot. People, servitude, if you like. So we don't know if it's one or the other. Okay, but it's obvious that Paul sends a letter back in an effort to get some sort of reconciliation between these two Christians. I mean, it's a perfect example for Paul to make the case about reconciliation and forgiveness, isn't it? And we'll get on the rest of this next week, okay? Until then, why don't you read Philemon's letter again, and if we get time, we'll start into Titus. Not sure quite, but we'll see how it goes, all right? Till then, read your Bible. Good night.